In this video, we're going to take a look at how to perform IP phone firmware migration from Enterprise to MPP via Cisco Cloud Upgrader. Topics covered in this video: number 1, prerequisites to perform the IP phone firmware migration from Enterprise to MPP, also known as 3PCC. Workflow demonstration of performing the firmware migration from Enterprise to MPP. And the last item, troubleshooting considerations. One of the things to note is for the firmware migration, licensing is required. The specific licensing that will be used when doing the firmware migration from Enterprise to MPP using the Cloud Upgrader is called Classic Licensing. And there's two different part numbers depending if you have the 8800 series of phone that you're doing the firmware migration, or if you have the 7800 series phones. So for example, if we have a 8800 series phone, currently has Enterprise firmware, and we want to migrate it to MPP firmware, then we need to purchase L-CP-8800XX-CNV equal symbol. Each phone does need its own license, so if you have one phone, it would be one license for the firmware migration. If you have 10 phones, it will be 10 licenses. And likewise, if we have a 7800 series phone, we're trying to migrate from Enterprise to MPP, it would be L-CP-2EM-78XX-CNV equal symbol. There's a very good document, white paper, at this link that goes into great detail regarding firmware migration for the Cisco IP phones. There are certain caveats that you should be aware of, and this document does get updated from time to time. If you're going to be working on a project where it involves migrating phones from Enterprise to 3PCC or vice versa, this is definitely a document you want to spend some time looking at. One thing I wanted to talk about briefly is as of recently, as of the recording of this video, there's been another method or another option added for migrating phones from Enterprise to MPP. However, this is only applicable if you're going to be using a phone with WebEx calling and you have an active WebEx calling account. And basically, there's an option when you log into WebEx Control Hub. On the left bottom side here, there's going to be an option where you can actually do migrations. So it's under Services, and then there's an option for migrations. And then when you get under migrations, there'll be a card or a function, if you will, migrating Enterprise phones to MPP firmware. So be aware that is an option. However, it is specific if the phones are only going to be used with WebEx calling, i.e. the phones will not be used with a third-party call controller, etc., etc. If you run into issues, you may be asking, which technical support team should I contact? And the answer really, it depends on the issue you're running into. So, for example, if you have entitlements, you have a subscription type of issue, then the team you want to contact regarding subscription-related issues is going to be the Cisco Entitlements team, and they can be reached at this URL right here. If the issues regarding licensing that we talked about a moment ago, you went ahead, ordered the licensing, for some reason you're not getting the email, or you got the email regarding the licensing you just ordered, but you have some questions, there's some steps in the actual email that you're going to get. You're going to get what is known as a PAC key, and then the PAC key needs to be tied together with the MAC address of the phone, and that's what actually generates the license key or the .lic file that's needed to be uploaded to the Cloud Upgrader site. But in any case, If you have questions regarding the licensing itself or issues, then the global licensing operations team, which can be contacted at this URL, would be the folks you want to contact regarding those issues. And then the last team would be if you're having issues with a physical phone. So for example, let's say the phone is having issues not getting a DHCP address, you're trying to reset the phone to factory default and you're having issues, etc., etc. You'd want to contact the small business support team, and it would be this URL right here. And then the last item here, and I'm going to read this verbatim, it's important to understand. It says here, my customer purchased the wrong phone type and needs to migrate the phone to the call controller they have. Can we do this? It says here, no. Please contact point of sales to return the phones and order the proper phones for the customer. Cisco will not replace phones or migrate phones for customers that make a mistake when ordering the phones. So this is something to be very careful. If you're a VAR and you're in a business of selling Cisco equipment, you definitely want to check and double check with a customer to understand what call controller they're going to. The last thing you want is a customer to order a large amount of phones only to realize what they ordered is not for the call controller they're going to be using. It can be a very expensive mistake, so definitely spend some time, take a look at the data sheets. There's actually two different sets of data sheets. There's one set that covers the Cisco Enterprise phones, which are really for CUCM. And then there's another set of data sheets that cover the phones that are 3PCC or MPP firmware, if you will. And that's for third-party call controller and or WebEx calling. So just be aware of those things. And again, the same document I mentioned a little bit ago is there's an excellent white paper that talks about the firmware migration. Another thing, also be aware, not all of the hardware phones might be eligible from a hardware standpoint to be firmware migratable. So other than licensing, there is also hardware considerations. In any case, you want to definitely take some time and go through this white paper. It does get updated from time to time, but you want to minimize any type of surprises in your project. Okay, so this next item is actually a chart that shows what enterprise firmware, what hardware phones are running enterprise firmware are eligible for the firmware migration. So there's three specific phones I would like to point out here that you have to be aware that there's only specific versions, hardware versions, that are supported. So the 7821 needs to be version 3 or later as far as the hardware version. The 7841 needs to be version 4 or later as far as a hardware version. And the 7861 needs to be version 3 or later as far as a hardware version for it to be eligible for the firmware migration. What this means is you still need to buy a license, a firmware migration license for each phone, but on top of that you also need to validate based upon this chart right here to make sure that hardware is eligible for firmware migration. So if you had a phone, let's say it's a 7821 and it's a version 2, it would not be eligible. So even if you purchased the firmware migration license and you attempted the firmware migration, it would fail. So just be aware of that. It is a caveat. Again, this is documented very well at the white paper document we mentioned a few times earlier. So it's definitely in your best interest to go ahead and spend some time looking at this document to validate when you're watching this video to understand what's eligible and what is not eligible, and any other caveats or techniques are available at the time that you watch this video. Okay, the next thing we're going to take a look at is, so at this point we've taken care of the licensing. So you have a license or firmware migration license for each individual phone you're going to be migrating from enterprise to 3PCC. What is the next step? Okay. So the next step is you're going to go basically to the upgrade.cisco.com site right here, and basically you're going to click on where it says here Enterprise and then it has WebEx calling MPP, and they'll basically get you to this additional URL here, the E2M_converter. So in any case, once you're here, step number 1 is going to be the actual hardware and licensing, which we were talking about on the previous slides. So it assumes at this point you validated the hardware based upon the chart we looked at, that it's eligible for firmware migration, you have the proper licensing, the licensing is tied to the MAC address of the appropriate phones, and then the next step is basically uploading the license file to this Cloud Upgrader site. So you basically click Choose File, go to this folder on your computer where the license is at, and then you would click Upload, and then generally next few seconds you'll get a indicator, it's either green, meaning you're A-OK, or it's going to give some type of error. So that's kind of step number 1. Okay, then the next thing to be aware is depending on your environment, if you're in a high secure environment, it is possible that your security policy is at an extent where it blocks a lot of the traffic, and you have to actually whitelist items to be permitted. So there is a section here that talks about network and firewall requirements, and this is something definitely if you're in an environment that has high security requirements as far as the security policies, you want to make sure that the security policy in the firewall is permitting this traffic. And another thing also, if you do start running into issues where you're doing everything correctly, the phone's not giving any errors, but it's actually not progressing with a firmware update, you would want to either yourself, if you have access to the firewall logs, or contact the security team that would have access to the firewall logs. You would want somebody to inspect the logs to make sure the traffic from the phone is not being blocked going out to internet, and vice versa. When the packets are supposed to be coming back from the cloud server, making sure they're able to get back to the phone. So just something to be aware of. It's also assumed that the phones are going to have DNS access, the VLAN that the phone's in for voice, that it also has internet access, and then also there's a couple different methods when you're doing the firmware migration via the Cloud Upgrader. There's some DHCP options. The method I'm going to use is going to be the simplest method, where I'm just going to put in the TFTP information into the TUI of the phone. But if you were going to use a DHCP option methods, meaning you're doing a bulk, like a fleet of phones, then you would need access to the DHCP server to make some changes as needed. Okay, so now we're at the point that we're going to instruct the actual phone to do the actual firmware migration. And I'm going to be using something called code-based activation. And with the code-based activation, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go to the settings button on the phone. It looks like a little gear icon. And then on the phone's telephone user interface, LCD, aka, we're going to go under admin settings. Then we're going to go under network Ethernet setup. Then we're going to go under IPv4 setup. And then under IP4 setup, we're going to go down the screen a tad to a section where it talks about alternate TFTP. And we're going to put this onto on/yes setting. And then the field right below that, that's going to now light up, meaning it becomes active, is under TFTP server 1. We're going to basically enter in 3.14.211.49, and then we're going to hit the apply button. And depending on your phone situation, if the phone has a trust list that's installed on the phone, so let's say you were using this with CUCM, for example, if this pops up, then you definitely want to select erase if you're prompted with a message. If you're not prompted with a message, don't worry about it. And then this process, once you apply this, the whole process takes about 15 minutes plus or minus 5 minutes. So be patient. You will see the phone reboot a couple different times, but generally it's been 15 minutes plus or minus 5 minutes. If you're doing a large batch of phones, and this large batch of phones all going to now concurrently pull down information for the firm migration across your internet access connection, and you have limited bandwidth. Obviously this may take substantially longer. So I would recommend maybe doing 1 or 2 phones first, just getting a feel for, number one, making sure the workflow works in your environment. Make sure there's no firewall issues or any other type of issues. And then also from a timing standpoint. And you still, even if you're successful, you still may want to do smaller batches just to get a sense like, okay, you do 1 or 2 phones, it's 15 minutes. And then maybe do 10 phones before you start doing a large batch of 50 or 100 phones, et cetera, just to make sure that you're not getting into such a long, stretched out firmware migration situation, and also you're not affecting performance like internet access performance for your site, et cetera. Okay, the next few items we're going to look at is what happens if we run into issues. So there is a good troubleshooting section on the same site page we're on. If you go towards the bottom, it says troubleshooting, and just a couple common ones to be aware of. It says here basically you're getting a message in the phone that says transition load authorization file not found. Contact your administrator. Okay, so basically here we want to make sure that the license file for that appropriate phone has been uploaded, what we looked at earlier. So we want to make sure that the model of the phone, the MAC address of the phone, it all matches appropriately. We want to make sure the actual license file, this is what it looks like inside the license file. We want to make sure that the license file has not been tampered with. So when you get the license file, do not modify anything in the license file because it will cause failure. But in any case, so in this type of situation, if we get this error, we basically want to make sure that your license file is the appropriate license file, meaning the model of the phone and the MAC address of the phone matches and it's been uploaded. The next error that you may run into is my phone is stuck at TLEX E2M firmware version. How can I migrate this back to enterprise? So this would be really a corner case if you come across this, but it is possible networking issue or some other odd issue, fluke, some type of oddball corner case situation came up. So no problem. If your phone gets stuck in this type of transitional firmware, the TLEX E2M refers to a transitional firmware, because the phone basically goes from, when you're doing the firmware migration from enterprise to 3PCC, there's really 3 stages it goes through. So it starts off stage 1, it's an enterprise firmware. If it's running super old enterprise firmware, then what the Cloud Upgrader will typically do is bump it up to a minimum version that is firmware migratable. So that first stage you may see a reboot, and when the phone reboots it still may have enterprise firmware on it. And then once it goes from that first stage to stage 2, it's going to be migrated from enterprise firmware to the transitional load, which is basically what you see here. And then once it puts on a transitional load on a phone itself through the Cloud Upgrader, then the last stage, stage 3, is going from transitional firmware to enterprise firmware. But in any case, if you run into this error, all you need to do is you'll go ahead and web into the phone. So basically http:// IP address of the phone, admin advanced. Once we're inside that menu or inside that mode, meaning we're admin advanced mode, then we're going to go to a tab top left side of the screen, voice, and then we're going to go down to provisioning section under voice. And then once we are in that area of the web interface, we're going to find where it says upgrade role. So there'll be a field there that says upgrade role, and then based upon the phone we're going to do the firmware, we're doing a firmware migration with, we're going to put the proper URL so it goes back to enterprise firmware. So in this example, I'm going to be using a speaker phone, aka conference room phone 8832. So if I was to run into this type of issue, I would basically navigate to the phone IP address, then admin advanced. I would go into the voice tab, then down to the provisioning section, and then within provisioning, I should say, tab, I would go down to the upgrade rules section, and then I would basically copy this URL and paste it in. And then at the bottom of the phone, I would go ahead and save the settings. The phone would reboot, and it would actually go in and migrate the phone back to enterprise firmware. Once it's migrated back, then we want to go in and start the firmware migration process again. One thing to note here is if you are running into any odd issues with a firmware migration, and everything looks good, but the phone is just not wanting to migrate, there's no errors, you're not detecting anything from a firewall standpoint, etc., blocking traffic, you may want to just reset the phone to factory default and then start the process again. I do have a video on how to reset the phone to factory default. I'll put a link in the bottom of the description here. But that's something, you know, if you've done the actual attempt at the firm migration once or twice and it just doesn't seem to be going, that would be the next logical step to take. Okay. So the next possible error that you might see is failure in transitional load authorization process. Contact your administrator. Okay. So it says here, this error typically means that the phone is unable to pull the configuration to authorize the migration. Please read the following network and firewall requirements. Yeah, so definitely if you're running into this, one consideration you could do, so let's say you have a setup within your organization where it's a different team that manages the actual security / firewall equipment, and you have to submit a request in, and let's say it takes, you know, a week or a few weeks for the whole process to occur. As a proof of concept, if you're permitted, you may want to take 1 or 2 phones with you to your home lab and then do the actual firmware migration in your home lab just to verify that it works, and you'll probably find it works just fine. And then that's pretty good evidence at that point of time there's something from a security standpoint in your environment that's blocking it, that's causing this issue. And that's something that you want to report back to the security team to whitelist the phones or whatever type of changes they need to make in the security policy. Okay, then the next error that the document talks about is enterprise phone status message, TFTP timeout. The phone is unable to connect to Cloud Upgrader or download the correct firmware version. In this case, bulk migration with CUCM, verify the load, make sure the network and firewall are fulfilled. Okay, so again, potential firewall networking security issues. There may have been something that was not properly set inside of CUCM when doing the bulk migration. Just verify everything again. Okay, then the second to the last error that we may get is enterprise phone status messages. It says upgrade rejected hardware compatible failure. Okay, if you recall a few slides earlier, we talked about the hardware eligibility for the firmware migration. Not all the hardware phones might be eligible for firmware migration. If you get this error, that's basically what it means. The phone you're trying to migrate, Enterprise to 3 PCC, the hardware is not eligible. So that's something before you go through this whole process of purchasing licensing, you know, getting everything prepped. You definitely want to verify that the hardware is eligible. If it's not eligible, then the results are going to be null. You know, it's just going to consume time, money, and you're not going to be able to do what you want to do. So definitely look at on the previous slides, I had a different URL at the bottom of the page, which is the white paper document. It talks about has a chart that illustrates the hardware that is eligible. Take a look at document. Document actually is quite large, has a lot of very good information. It is updated from time to time, so you definitely want to spend time looking at the document. And by the way, they have a link right here for that document. They'll give you the details as far as hardware version, as far as eligibility, etc., etc. Okay, then the last one here they list is I followed the manual procedure partially and want to use a Cloud Upgrader to complete the migration. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. It says here the migration with this tool automates multiple steps but is not exactly the same process as other processes, so it's difficult to combine both. If you decide to follow the manual process with your own HTTP, TFTP server, or CUCM hosting the files, then we recommend to complete it. Okay, so basically with this situation, you don't want to halfway through the procedure stop if you're using one method and then try to now shift gears and use a different procedure. It will cause problems. So definitely read through the procedure completely. Make sure that whatever resources the procedure calls for, that you have those resources before attempting any type of firmware migration. Worst case, if the phones get stuck in a transitional firmware, you can always take them back, kind of what we looked at a few moments ago. Or you can reset the phones to factory default, etc., but definitely have a game plan ahead of time. Okay, we're going to go now to the upgrade.cisco.com site, known as the Cloud Upgrader site. The specific section we're going to is Enterprise to WebEx calling /MPP firmware migration. And within the Enterprise to WebEx calling /MPP firmware migration section, it lists here that after successful migration, the phone will be converted to MPP firmware version 11.3.3. Okay, so here we want to go ahead and upload the actual firmware migration license. So this is going to be the actual license that's referred to as Classic. This license is specific to individual phone. So when the license is purchased, it'll be actually activated with a specific MAC address. And you'll see here basically this is the MAC address of my phone. In this case it's an 8832 speakerphone I'm using. And this license basically using a pack which you would get via email once you purchase the firmware migration license, that is combined with the MAC address of the actual phone, and then it basically results in generating a .lic file, a license file you see right here. And we're going to go ahead and tell it to upload the actual license. Okay, and it shows that the license has uploaded successfully. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the phone firmware before the migration. So we're going to go down to System Information. Notice it's just the 8832, has no 3PCC in the name. And then we look at the active load. It's a SIP 8832 12-8-1. It's enterprise firmware. Okay, so next we're going to go ahead and do the firmware migration process using the Cloud Upgrader. Okay, so we're going to go under Settings. We're going to go down to Admin Settings, Network Setup, Ethernet Setup, IPv4 Setup, and then we're going to go down the menu here, and we're going to enable the alternate TFTP. We're going to go to the TFTP server 1, and we're going to go ahead and type in the TFTP IP address 3.14.211.49. We're going to hit apply. The process typically takes about 15 minutes, plus or minus 5 minutes. So please be patient with the process. The phone will do a number of different reboots. On the first reboot, the phone may be upgraded to newer enterprise firmware depending how old the current firmware is. So that may be reboot number 1. The second one will be the phone going from the enterprise firmware to transitional firmware, and that's where actually the license is checked with the transitional firmware. So if you do run into a licensing issue, you'll be basically in the transitional firmware. And then the third step will be migrating from the transitional firmware over to the enterprise firmware. So this does take some time. As I mentioned, approximately 15 minutes plus or minus 5 minutes is what I've been seeing on average when I've been doing this procedure. Okay, we just got a message, device will restart in X amount of seconds, ready to upgrade. Okay, so that's a good sign, so we'll give the phone here a few seconds. Okay, the phone went ahead and rebooted. For the first time, we see there's a Cisco logo at this point of time. As I mentioned earlier, if you're running into a situation where the phone is not progressing, it seems like it's just sitting still, you've entered in all the correct information, but there's no errors, again, the phone is not progressing, you definitely want to take a look at the firewall log, because what could be happening is the phone is sending out packets and waiting for it to receive packets back for the TFTP server, and it's just waiting and waiting, but it's being perhaps dropped at the firewall or being blocked at the firewall. So if you run into that situation, if you have access to the firewall log, please take a look at the firewall log. Check and see if the IP address of the phone, if the firewall log is indicating that's blocking or dropping those packets. If you don't have access, please contact the security team and go ahead and give them feedback, let them know what IP address the phone is at. Also, if the layer 2 portion of the network is extended all the way to the firewall, you can also include the MAC address of the phone. So when they're looking at the logs in the firewall, they can have both options of cross-referencing it either via phone IP address and or MAC address, if you will. Okay, so this basically the phone has just rebooted, and we're going to wait here. Typically there's going to be multiple reboots, typically anywhere from 2 to 3 is what I typically find when doing the firmware migration. But going back, if it is a firewall situation where, again, there's really no error messages, but the phone's not progressing, you've entered in all the correct information. Very easy technique, if you're permitted, is, okay, we're getting another message, ready to upgrade, device will restart in X amount of seconds, great. Is to take the phone actually home and do the firmware migration from your home network. And then see, what you'll find is typically they'll work just fine, and that's a good indicator there's something occurring in your corporate network as far as firewall or security policy blocking the packets. And we're going to give it a few minutes here for it to go through its process. Once you've completed 1 or 2 phones and you know the workflow does work in your environment, okay, we're getting system booting, configuration, check in progress, okay, very good sign. So once you've completed 1 or 2 phones as far as migrating, and you have a batch of a bulk amount of phones, definitely you want to progressively increase the volume as far as how many phones you have. So let's say you have a couple hundred phones, you first probably want to do 10 and just see, one is how long is it going to take, because again there'll be some impact as far as the WAN bandwidth. And number 2, you want to see when you're doing 10 concurrently, are there going to be any issues that occur? Are all 10 going to go through? Okay, another message just popped up. Okay, it says transition, revision, upgrade, or authorize upgrade in progress. Excellent. So at this point, it has gone through the validation of the licensing, and it's been validated as A-OK, and now it's basically at the final stage where it's going to be migrating from the transitional firmware to the enterprise firmware. But in any case, going back to the discussion, so if you have a larger fleet of phones that you need to migrate, then you definitely want to increase the number of concurrent phones you're migrating in a slow, progressive manner. So you don't want to go from just doing 1 or 2 phones and knowing it was successful and then trying to do like 100+ phones. You probably want to do it in stages. So 1 or 2 phones, make sure it's successful. log the time. Was it 15 minutes? And then going to do 10 phones. Again, validating it's successful. Okay, the phone is just rebooting here. Validate that it's successful. How long did it take? Was it still 15 minutes plus or minus 5 minutes? Or are we now pushing 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour? Again, depending on the bandwidth availability. And if it is a larger batch, you probably want to do it during a maintenance window, aka when nobody's around, is to minimize the impact for the site as far as internet usage, because obviously there'll be cloud-based applications or other applications that the users are using during the workday, and you want to minimize this impacting performance of those other applications. So right now the phone should be at the final stages where it's booting up within the 3PCC firmware. So what we want to do is we want to verify once we've completed the firmware migration from Enterprise to 3PCC, we want to go into the phone and we want to verify that it's indeed running 3PCC firmware. Okay, so it's right now in runtime. It says its configuration check is in progress. This will take a few minutes. Okay, no problem. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to go into settings, and then we will go down towards the status, or excuse me, we're going to go down towards the product information. And so if you notice, the name of the product now has 3PCC, so it's CP. When you first boot up the phone and 3PCC firmware the first time, it does give you this activation code. And this is something that's used with WebEx calling Control Hub, where you can generate an activation code and then enter it in to the actual phone. But in any case, we notice that the phone is running 3PCC firmware. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully this helps you with this process. Thank you.